You are listening to HOA Busted. The curb stripe became her favorite excuse. I pulled into my driveway after a 12-hour shift running new circuits in a strip mall, and Karen was standing in the street next to a flatbed tow truck with her arms crossed. She yelled that if I moved my car, she would charge a tow cancellation fee anyway. The driver was already lowering the wheel lift behind my sedan. "You can appeal after I file it," she said, waving a clipboard at me like a weapon. I stepped out of my truck and looked at my car. It was parked exactly where I always parked it, 3 feet from the curb on a public street in front of my own house. There was no fire hydrant, no red curb, no signs saying I could not be there. I turned back to Karen and asked what the violation was. She tapped the clipboard with one finger and said guest parking decal expired last month, so the vehicle is unauthorized. I told her I did not have a guest, that was my car, and I lived here. She smiled and said the HOA changed the rules in March. All secondary vehicles need a permit now, and I never applied. I asked when the notice went out. She said it was posted on the website and mailed to all residents. I never got a letter. She shrugged and said that is not my problem. The tow is already authorized. The driver stepped around and hooked the lift under my rear wheels. I asked him to stop and show me the authorization. He pulled a laminated placard from his vest pocket and flashed it at me for half a second, then tucked it back. Karen said the placard proves the tow is legal, and if I interfered she would call the police for obstruction. I pulled out my phone and started recording. She stepped closer and said I have all day, and so does my fine meter. The driver cranked the lift and my car's rear end rose off the pavement with a hydraulic whine and a rattle of chain. I work as a licensed electrician in Cape Coral, Florida, and every dollar matters right now because my wife's mother just had surgery, and we are covering part of the bill. An unexpected tow fee and impound cost could wreck our budget for the month. I asked Karen how much the fee was. She said $200 for the tow call, $50 for the cancellation if I wanted to stop it now, and then daily storage at the yard. I asked if I could pay the permit fee instead and keep the car here. She said no, the vehicle is already in custody, and I would need to go to the tow yard, pay the release, get the permit, then bring proof back to the HOA office before I could register the car again. I asked where the tow yard was. She said it was on the east side of town, about 20 minutes away, and they closed at 5. I looked at my watch. It was 4:30. She grinned and said I should hurry. The driver climbed into the cab and the truck started rolling forward with my car hanging off the back. I asked Karen for a receipt or a ticket. She peeled a bright orange sticker off her roll and slapped it on my mailbox post. No readable text, just a vivid orange square that screamed violation. She said the ticket number is on the sticker. Call the office tomorrow if I have questions. Then she walked to her white SUV parked across the street and drove off. I stood in my driveway and watched the tow truck disappear around the corner. My neighbor, an older guy named Jim, was standing on his porch with his wife, both of them staring like they were watching a reality show. Jim shook his head and went inside. I took pictures of the sticker, the empty curb, and the street. Then I called my buddy Marcus, who works in IT and has helped me with tech stuff before. I told him what happened and asked if he could help me pull records. He said he could look at metadata if I had digital copies, and he could verify timestamps if I needed proof of when something was sent or posted. I thanked him and hung up. I drove to the tow yard in my truck. The gate was still open when I got there, but just barely. A clerk behind a bulletproof window told me the fee was $225 for the tow, and the first day of storage started tomorrow. I asked to see the authorization paperwork. She slid a photocopy through the slot. It had the HOA name, Harbor Point Village Association, and a signature I did not recognize. The date was today, but the timestamp said 11:15 in the morning. I asked her when the truck was dispatched. She checked her screen and said dispatch logged it at 4:10. I pointed at the timestamp on the authorization and said this was signed 5 hours before the tow. How is that possible? She shrugged and said the HOA pre-authorizes tows all the time. They send us a list and we pick them up when we see them. I felt my stomach drop. I asked if she meant the HOA sends a list of cars to tow without notifying the owners first. She looked uncomfortable and said I would have to talk to my HOA about their process. She just handles intake. I took a picture of the paperwork through the glass. She said no photos. I said I already took it. She buzzed me out and I walked to the lot to see my car. It was parked in a row of vehicles behind a chain-link fence. A wheel clamp was locked on the front driver's side tire. I asked why the clamp was on there if the car was already impounded. A guy in a safety vest said it is policy, prevents roll-offs. I asked when I could get the car back. He said any time after I paid the fees and brought proof of registration and insurance. I told him I had all that, I just needed to get the HOA permit sorted out first. He said then I should go do that, and he walked away. I went home and dug through my mail. No notice from the HOA about secondary vehicle permits. I checked my email, nothing. I logged into the HOA website and looked at the announcements page. There was a post from March 8th saying new parking enforcement guidelines were in effect immediately. All secondary vehicles required registration and a windshield decal. Failure to comply would result in towing. The post had 0 comments. I checked the mailing archive and there was no record of a physical letter being sent. I took screenshots of everything and texted them to Marcus. He replied that he could check the website post metadata tomorrow and see when it was actually published versus when it claimed to be published. I called the HOA office the next morning. A receptionist answered and I asked to speak to someone about a tow dispute. She transferred me to Karen. Karen picked up and said, "What can I do for you?" And I reminded her who I was. She said, "Oh, the electrician. Did I get my car back yet?" I said no, because I needed the permit first, and I wanted to know why I was not notified about the new rule. She said the rule was posted on the website and I was responsible for checking it. I said the website is not legal notice in Florida. HOAs are required to mail written notice of rule changes. She said the board voted to allow electronic notice as the primary method and physical mail as optional. I asked when that vote happened. She said February. I asked for the meeting minutes. She said they were not published yet. I said state law requires minutes to be available within a certain time frame. She said I could file a formal records request and wait 30 days. I hung up and called a local attorney who handles HOA disputes. He listened to my story and said it sounded like selective enforcement, especially if other residents with secondary vehicles were not being towed. He said if I could prove the HOA was targeting specific owners or that the rule was not properly noticed, I might have a case. He also said if I wanted an emergency stop on the fees I needed to file an injunction request today and provide at least one piece of evidence showing the HOA acted in bad faith. I asked what counted as bad faith. He said anything that showed they knew the process was improper, like internal emails or a pattern of targeting. I told him about the pre-authorization list the tow yard mentioned. He said that could be huge if I could get proof. He charged $200 an hour and I did not have that kind of budget right now, so I said I would try to gather evidence first and call him back if I needed help filing. I spent the afternoon going door to door in my neighborhood. I asked neighbors if they had secondary vehicles and if they had been towed or fined. Most people said no, they only had one car per household. A couple said they had 2 cars but never heard about the permit rule. One guy, a retired teacher named Alan, said he got a warning sticker last week but it disappeared the next day and he never got a fine. He said he thought maybe it was a mistake. I asked if he still had the sticker. He said no. It blew away. I thanked him and kept going. Jim, the neighbor who had watched my tow, invited me in. He said his wife Linda had taken photos of the whole thing from their porch because she thought it looked shady. He showed me the pictures on his phone. Clear shots of the tow truck, Karen standing with the clipboard, the wheel lift hooking my car, and even a zoomed-in shot of Karen peeling a sticker off her roll. The photos were time-stamped 4:27 p.m. I asked if he would be willing to write a statement saying what he saw. He said absolutely. Karen has been targeting people all year and nobody does anything because they are scared of fines. Linda printed the photos and Jim typed up a one-page witness statement on his computer, signed it, and dated it. I made copies. I went back to the HOA office the next morning with the witness statement and photos. Karen was at the front desk. I told her I had evidence the tow was improper and I wanted the fees reversed. She looked at the papers and said witness statements do not override board policy. I said the board policy was not legally noticed. She said that is my opinion, not a fact. I asked again for the February meeting minutes. She said they were still being finalized. I said it had been 4 months. She leaned back in her chair and said I can fine you daily until you give up and you cry, so I suggest you pay the fees and move on. I let her talk, because every word was helping me. I was recording the whole conversation on my phone in my shirt pocket. Florida is a two-party consent state for recordings, but there are exceptions for documenting potential fraud or threats, and her tone was crossing the line into harassment. I asked if she was threatening me. She said no, I am informing you of HOA policy. I said I wanted to request a hearing with the full board. She said fine. The next board meeting is in 3 weeks. I said I needed an emergency hearing sooner because I could not afford 3 weeks of impound fees. She said emergency hearings are only granted for health and safety issues. Parking is not an emergency. I said my family had medical expenses and the fees were a financial hardship. She said that is not the HOA's problem. I asked if there was anyone above her I could talk to. She said she was the treasurer and the board liaison for parking enforcement, so no. I asked for the board president's contact. She said the president does not take calls from residents. All complaints go through the office. I said I would file a formal complaint then. She slid a blank form across the desk and said, "Fill this out. We will get back to you in 30 days. I took the form and left. I called Marcus and told him I needed help digging into the HOA's digital records. He said he could not hack anything, but if I had access to the website or any shared files, he could analyze them. I logged into the resident portal that night and downloaded every document I could find: meeting agendas, rule updates, violation notices, financial reports. I sent the files to Marcus. He called me the next day and said the parking rule announcement post was created on March 8th, but the metadata showed it was edited on April 23rd, 2 weeks ago, and the edit included a backdated timestamp. Someone had changed the post to make it look older. I asked if he could prove that. He said yes. He pulled the raw HTML and the server logs if I had access to them. I did not, but I asked if a screenshot of the metadata would work. He said maybe, but a sworn affidavit from him would be better. That evening, I got a call from the tow yard. The clerk said my car had been flagged for a second violation because the registration did not match the current address on file. I said that was impossible, my registration was current and my address was correct. She said the HOA sent an updated list and my car was on it again. I asked what that meant. She said if I did not resolve it in 48 hours, they could apply for an abandoned vehicle title transfer. I asked if she was serious. She said it is policy for vehicles that sit more than 60 days, but the HOA can request expedited processing. I said my car had been there 3 days. She said I should talk to my HOA. I hung up and immediately called my attorney. He said that sounded like extortion and I should file a police report. I went to the Cape Coral police station and explained the situation. The officer took my information but said HOA disputes are civil matters unless there is clear evidence of fraud or theft. I showed him the tow authorization with the pre-signed timestamp and the witness photos. He said it looked shady, but I would need to take it to court or the state HOA regulatory board. I filed a complaint with the Florida Department of Business and Professional Regulation, which oversees HOAs. The online form asked for evidence, so I uploaded everything: the witness statement, the photos, the metadata screenshots, the tow paperwork, and a timeline I had built in a spreadsheet. The confirmation page said complaints are reviewed within 60 days. I did not have 60 days. The next morning, I went back to my neighborhood and knocked on more doors. A woman named Sarah, who lived 2 streets over, said she got towed last month for the same secondary vehicle rule. She paid the fees because she did not know she could fight it. I asked if she had any paperwork. She said she had the receipt and the HOA fine notice. I asked if I could make copies. She invited me in and showed me a folder of documents. Her fine notice was dated March 10th, 2 days after the rules supposedly went into effect, and it referenced a warning she never received. Her tow receipt showed the same vendor and the same pre-authorization signature as mine. I took pictures of everything and added Sarah to my witness list. By the end of the week, I had statements from 4 neighbors who had been towed or fined under the same rule, all without proper notice. I also had Marcus's affidavit about the backdated website post. I compiled everything into a 3-ring binder with tabs for each section: timeline, witness statements, financial records, metadata analysis, tow vendor documents, and Florida statute citations. I made 3 copies. I called the HOA office again and demanded an emergency board hearing. Karen said no. I said I had evidence of fraud and I was going to the state and the media if she did not schedule it. She put me on hold for 5 minutes, then came back and said the board would meet with me Saturday morning at 9. I said I would be there. Saturday morning, I showed up at the HOA Community Center with my binder and a folder of extra copies. The board president, a retired guy named Doug, was there along with Karen and 2 other board members. Doug asked me to present my case. I opened the binder and walked them through the timeline. I showed the witness photos with timestamps, the metadata proving the website post was backdated, the tow authorization showing pre-signed paperwork, and the statements from other residents who were towed without notice. I pointed out that the February meeting minutes, which supposedly authorized electronic-only notice, still had not been published, which meant the rule change was not valid. Karen interrupted and said the website post was updated for clarity, not backdated. I asked her to explain why the metadata showed an edit 2 weeks ago that changed the publish date. She said the IT contractor must have made an error. I said that was convenient. Doug asked if I had proof the contractor changed it versus someone with admin access. I said I had Marcus's affidavit and the raw server logs if they wanted to subpoena them. Karen said that was not necessary. The board stood by the rule. I asked if the board had seen the evidence that the tow vendor was working off a pre-authorized target list. Doug looked at Karen. She said the vendor operates independently. The HOA just provides authorization for violations. I said the vendor clerk told me the HOA sends them a list of cars to pick up. Karen said that was a miscommunication. I slid a printed email across the table. It was from the HOA's attorney to Doug, dated 3 days ago. The subject line was Parking Enforcement Concerns. The email said the attorney had reviewed the complaint I filed with the state and advised the board to cease all pending tows and fines until the rule change could be properly noticed and voted on again, because the current process exposed the HOA to liability. The email specifically said, I cannot continue to represent the association in this matter if the board proceeds without correcting the notice deficiencies. I had gotten the email from Doug's trash can outside the community center the night before, because I saw him throw a stack of papers in the bin after a meeting, and I took a chance. Doug's face went red. He asked where I got that. I said it was in the public trash outside a publicly accessible building, so it was fair game. Karen stood up and said this meeting is over. I said no. We were going to finish this, because I had more. I pulled out a second document, a spreadsheet I had built from public records requests to the tow vendor. It showed 23 vehicles towed from Harbor Point Village Association in the last 60 days, and 15 of them were registered to households that had filed complaints or disputes with the HOA in the prior 6 months. I said that is not random enforcement, that is retaliation. One of the other board members, a quiet woman named Lisa, asked Karen if that was true. Karen said she did not have to answer that. Lisa said yes, she did. Because if the HOA was targeting people, it could trigger a state investigation and cost the association thousands in fines. Karen grabbed her roll of stickers and her clipboard and walked toward the door. Doug told her to sit down. She said she was done being accused of things by some electrician who thought he was a lawyer. Doug said if she left, the board would vote to suspend her pending an audit. She stopped. I let her talk, because every word was helping me. She turned and said fine. The vendor had a system where they prioritized certain addresses based on complaint history, but that was just efficiency, not targeting. I asked if she had documentation of that system. She said it was verbal. I said that was convenient. Lisa asked Doug if they could vote to halt all towing immediately. Doug said they could. Karen said that would leave the neighborhood with no parking enforcement. Lisa said they could hire a new vendor and start fresh with proper procedures. The board voted 3-1 to suspend all parking enforcement pending a full review. Karen was the only no vote. Doug said they would refund my tow and impound fees and issue a formal apology. I said I also wanted the fees refunded for the other 4 residents I had found who were improperly towed. Doug said he would bring that to the next meeting. I said no, I wanted it in writing today, and I wanted the HOA to cover my lost wages for the days I spent fighting this instead of working. Lisa said that was reasonable. Doug said he would draft a settlement agreement and have it ready by Monday. I said I also wanted the HOA to adopt a written policy that required physical mailed notice for all rule changes, and a 30-day grace period before enforcement. Doug agreed. Karen stood up and said, "This is insane, I have followed every rule." I said no, she had not, and I had proof she had been feeding the tow vendor a target list that included people who complained. She said I could not prove that. I said I already did, and the state board would see the same evidence when they investigated. She said they would not find anything. I said they would find the spreadsheet and the vendor's intake logs, and the vendor would flip on her to avoid losing their license. She walked out and slammed the door. The meeting ended, and Doug asked me to stay. He said he appreciated me bringing the evidence forward, and he was sorry the HOA had let it get this far. He said Karen would likely resign or be removed at the next election. I said I did not care what happened to her as long as the predatory towing stopped. Doug said the board would be reviewing the vendor contract and likely terminating it. I asked what would happen to the target list. He said he would request a copy from the vendor and make sure it was destroyed. I said I wanted a copy too for my records. He said he would see what he could do. I went home and called Marcus to tell him the board caved. He said that was amazing and asked what happened to Karen. I said she walked out and would probably be gone soon. He asked if I got everything in writing. I said not yet, but Doug promised a settlement by Monday. Marcus said I should not trust promises. I should camp out at the HOA office until I had a signed paper. I said I would. Monday morning I showed up at the HOA office at 8. Karen was not there. The receptionist said she called in sick. I asked when Doug would be in. She said he had a meeting at 10. I said I would wait. I sat in the lobby for 2 hours. Doug arrived at 10:15 and waved me into his office. He handed me a 2-page settlement agreement. It included full refunds for my tow and impound fees, reimbursement for 2 days of lost wages, refunds for the other 4 residents, a formal apology letter, and a commitment to adopt the new notice policy. It also included a clause saying I agreed not to pursue further legal action against the HOA or Karen personally. I asked if Karen had signed off on this. Doug said she had not, but the board had the authority to settle without her approval. I asked if she was still on the board. He said she submitted her resignation that morning. I read the agreement twice and signed it. Doug gave me a check for $875, which covered the tow, impound, and wages. He said the other refunds would be processed by the end of the week. I thanked him and left. 2 days later, I got a call from Sarah, the neighbor who had been towed in March. She said she got her refund check and a letter from the board apologizing for the improper enforcement. She asked how I managed to pull it off. I said I just kept pushing until they ran out of excuses. She said she wished she had fought it at the time. I said it was not too late. The board was reviewing all the tows from the last 6 months and issuing refunds to anyone who filed a dispute. She said she would call the office. The story did not end there. A week later, the local news ran a segment about HOA towing scams in Southwest Florida. They interviewed me and 2 other residents from different neighborhoods who had similar experiences with predatory vendors. The reporter said the state board had opened investigations into 3 HOAs, including Harbor Point Village Association. The tow vendor I dealt with lost their contract with 2 other HOAs and was facing a license suspension hearing. Karen was not mentioned by name in the report, but anyone in the neighborhood knew who was behind it. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of HOA chaos and justice served. The fallout kept rolling. The HOA hired a new management company to oversee enforcement and compliance. The new company required all board actions to be documented with meeting minutes published within 7 days. And all rule changes had to be mailed to residents with a 30-day comment period before a vote. Doug stayed on as president but brought in 2 new board members who ran on a transparency platform. One of them was Jim, my neighbor who took the witness photos. Marcus helped me file a formal complaint with the tow vendor's licensing board, and they launched an audit of the company's records. The audit found that the vendor had been running similar target list schemes with 4 other HOAs in the county, using pre-authorized paperwork to bypass proper notice requirements. The vendor's owner tried to blame it on a rogue dispatcher, but the dispatcher produced emails showing the owner had approved the lists. The vendor lost their license 3 months later. Karen tried to run for the board again the following year under a return-to-strong enforcement platform, but she lost in a landslide. I heard from another neighbor that she moved out of the neighborhood 6 months later. I never saw her again. The tow yard I dealt with also faced consequences. A class action lawsuit was filed by residents from multiple HOAs who had been improperly towed using the vendor's target list system. The yard settled for an undisclosed amount, but the clerk who had been honest with me about the pre-authorization process kept her job and became a key witness in the state investigation. She later told me she was relieved someone finally called it out, because she had been uncomfortable with the scheme for months, but did not know how to report it without losing her job. The HOA attorney who sent the email advising the board to halt enforcement ended up representing 3 other residents in disputes against their HOAs. He told me my case helped him build a template for fighting improper towing and selective enforcement, and he was using it to train other attorneys in the area. He offered me a discount on future legal work if I ever needed it, but I have not had any more HOA problems since. The settlement that included refunds and limits on enforcement became a model policy for the county HOA coalition. Several other associations adopted similar notice requirements and grace periods after seeing how badly Harbor Point's predatory system had backfired. Doug presented the case at a coalition meeting and credited me with pushing the board to act before the state board forced harsher penalties. I kept a copy of the target list that Doug gave me. It had my name on it along with 15 other residents. I reached out to all of them and shared my evidence and process. 10 of them filed disputes and got refunds. The other 5 had already moved or decided it was not worth the hassle, but at least they knew they had been targeted and it was not random bad luck. The most satisfying moment came about 8 months after the whole ordeal ended. I was at the community center for a budget meeting, and the new board presented the annual financial report. The line item for parking enforcement had dropped by 70% compared to the previous year, because the new vendor charged flat monthly fees instead of per tow bounties. The line item for legal fees had also dropped, because the HOA was not defending frivolous disputes anymore. Doug pointed out that the cost savings were being redirected to neighborhood improvements, and he thanked the residents who had pushed for transparency and accountability. Jim leaned over and whispered that I should take a bow. I did not, but I appreciated the thought. After the meeting, Lisa came up to me and said she had been terrified to vote against Karen at that emergency hearing. But seeing the evidence laid out made it clear the HOA was in the wrong. She said it taught her to trust documents over personalities, and she had applied that lesson to every board decision since. I also learned that Karen had been running a similar enforcement scheme at her previous HOA before moving to Harbor Point. That board had quietly asked her to resign after a complaint about selective fines, but they never reported it to anyone. If they had flagged it to the state board, she might not have been able to pull the same stunt again. I made sure the state investigator knew about that history, and they added it to her file. She will not be able to serve on another HOA board in Florida without that record following her. The funniest karma moment came when the state board reviewed the vendor's intake logs and found that Karen herself had been cited for a parking violation 2 years earlier, before she joined the board. She had disputed the fine and won because the vendor had not followed proper notice procedures. The same procedures she later ignored when she started running the target list scheme. The state investigator included that detail in the report, and it became a running joke in the neighborhood. Karen insists on a deadline, and the timestamp proves she lied became a shorthand for anyone caught in hypocrisy. The management company that took over after the scandal implemented a new policy. Any board member involved in enforcement decisions had to recuse themselves from voting on disputes involving residents they had personally cited. It was a direct response to Karen's conflict of interest, and it passed unanimously. The policy also required the management company to review all enforcement actions monthly and flag any patterns that suggested targeting or bias. It added a layer of oversight that made it much harder for one person to weaponize the rules. The final piece of the payoff came a year later, when the HOA held its annual meeting. The board presented a resolution formally apologizing to the residents who had been improperly towed and acknowledging that the enforcement system had been abused. The resolution passed, and Doug read it aloud in front of the room. Karen was not there, but several of the residents who had been on the target list were, and they clapped when it was done. It was not a dramatic moment, but it felt like a closing of the chapter. I still live in Harbor Point, and I still drive the same car that was towed. I added the HOA parking permit decal to the windshield, and I have not had a single issue since. The portable folding sign stand that Karen used to keep trying to place near my parking space disappeared after she resigned. I heard it ended up in the HOA storage closet, and nobody wanted to touch it. It became a symbol of the old enforcement regime, and leaving it in storage was easier than throwing it away and reopening old wounds. I ran into the tow truck driver a few months later at a gas station. He recognized me and apologized for hooking up my car that day. He said he had been following company orders and did not realize the authorization was part of a shady scheme. He said he quit that vendor and now works for a company that only does police-requested tows. I told him I did not blame him. He was just doing his job. He said he appreciated that, but he still felt bad about it. We shook hands and went our separate ways. Marcus still helps me with tech stuff whenever I need it, and he still jokes that I owe him a beer for every hour he spent digging through metadata. I have bought him several beers, and I will buy him several more. His affidavit was the piece of evidence that made it impossible for Karen to deny the website post had been backdated, and it turned the whole case in my direction. The one thing I did not expect was how many people reached out to me after the story went public. I got emails and messages from residents in other HOAs across Florida asking for advice on fighting improper enforcement. I shared my process, my evidence templates, and my timeline format. Some of them won their disputes, and some of them did not, but at least they knew they were not alone and they had a roadmap for fighting back. The HOA board invited me to join as a member after Jim's term ended, but I declined. I did not want to be part of the system, even a reformed one. I told Doug I would rather stay as a resident advocate and keep the board honest from the outside. He said he understood, and he appreciated me staying involved. I still attend meetings occasionally, just to make sure the transparency policies are being followed, and so far they have been. The neighborhood feels different now. People are less scared of the board, and the board is more careful about enforcement. The tow vendor's truck does not show up unless there is a legitimate violation, and even then the owner gets a warning first. The gate still glitches sometimes, but Karen is not around to use the delay as an excuse to claim trespassing, so it is just an annoying tech issue instead of a weaponized gotcha. I learned a lot from the experience. I learned that documentation is everything, that witnesses matter, that metadata can prove fraud, and that even a small group of targeted residents can force a corrupt system to change if they organize and fight back. I also learned that some people, like Karen, will abuse any power they are given, and the only way to stop them is to shine a light on what they are doing and hold them accountable. The tow vendor blacklists the HOA after Karen is caught ordering staged photos, and the board has to scramble for a new contract. That final consequence came 6 months after the settlement, when the state investigation uncovered emails showing Karen had asked the vendor to take photos of cars parked illegally, even if the cars were not actually there, just to build a case for stricter enforcement. The vendor refused and flagged the request to their compliance officer, who reported it to the state board. The vendor terminated their contract with Harbor Point immediately, and Karen's name was added to a state watch list for HOA officials with credible fraud complaints. The management company disciplines the rep who enabled it, firing the compliance coordinator who had been rubber-stamping Karen's authorization requests without reviewing the evidence. Karen is forced to apologize on the record in front of the room, which happened at the annual meeting when the board required her to read a prepared statement as part of the settlement. She read it in a flat, mechanical tone, and left immediately after without taking questions. It was the last time most residents saw her. The entire ordeal cost me time, stress, and lost wages, but it also gave me something back, proof that fighting bureaucracy is possible if you refuse to quit and you bring receipts. I kept the binder on a shelf in my garage, and every time I see it I remember that the system only works if people push back when it breaks. I am glad you tuned in.